This series is all about universes, multiverses, planets, worlds, continents and cities. We're delving not into specific games, but into the menus created for them. We'll be looking at where these settings came from, their major features, and why you should consider them for your own gaming experiences. This one, I'm a little intimidated about covering, but at the same time, it has informed a lot of my approach to world building. It is a behemoth, a titan of fantasy, subject to role-playing, card, computer, board and war games, covered in movies and television shows. But primarily, it is a world of literature. The daunting subject for this episode is Tolkien's Middle-earth. Now, there is plenty of coverage regarding the works of Tolkien and studies thereof. So I'm going to be treating the base source material here in a more light-handed way in this video. This will afford more time to focus on Middle-earth as a world for role-playing, but maybe a deeper delve into my own thoughts and experiences of the epics passed on to us by Tolkien could be in order at a later date. The origins of Middle-earth, as imagined and developed by Tolkien, go back to 1913, with Tolkien's reading of The Christ by Cynewulf, a set of Old English poems that recount the advent and life of Christ. Specifically, in Christ I, concerning the Advent, Tolkien was attracted to the name Eärendil, which he would later repurpose as Eärendil the Mariner within the Silmarillion, and Midgangad. This Old English term has the same etymology as the anglicised Norse term for the world of men, Midgard, the middle home, the middle earth. From here, Tolkien developed a cosmology, history, mythology and geography, covering everything from the creation to the development of the sun and the moon, to esoterica such as the changing understanding from flat earth to spherical earth geometry. In the case of Tolkien's world, Arda, a literal physical change. He populated it with elves, immortal beings that drive much of the world's narrative in its early history, men who come into their own during the later history, particularly following the reshaping of the world, dwarves, beings drawn from traditional Germanic myth and placed firmly in the bones of Middle-earth, down-to-earth hobbits, and numerous beings of corrupted nature fashioned by the evil god Morgoth and his associates. J.R.R. Tolkien himself was a philologist, an interest that found him as Professor of Anglo-Saxon for 20 years, followed by a further stint as Professor of English Language and Literature from 1945 to his retirement in 1959. Much of his studies in fantasy revolved around linguistics, creating languages, and then using the evolving Arda to similarly evolve the languages that he assigned to the various beings within it. This particular drive he followed until his death in 1975, which, from a role-playing perspective, left a rich mine of word forms and structures for those wishing to expand Middle-earth, and a number of concepts to use and footpaths to tread for those wishing to follow similar routes for their own creations. The most famous works that introduced the world to Tolkien's concepts came in the form of the 1937 children's book The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, and the hexalogy of The Lord of the Rings, compiled into 3 volumes, 1954's The Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers, and 1955's The Return of the King. These 7 works, or 4 or 2, depending on how you count them, form the core of Middle-earth canon, and most of the works that we see today in movies, TV and other media are drawn from them and their accompanying appendices. After Tolkien's death, his son Christopher picked up the challenge of compiling and publishing the copious notes that his father had left that further detailed his ideas. This resulted initially in 1977's The Silmarillion, which covered the history of Tolkien's world from its creation to the events of Lord of the Rings, the first through to the Fourth Ages, and 1980's Unfinished Tales, which were, literally, that, a compilation of material that Tolkien had never finished, organised into some semblance of sanity. It's funny, looking back now, how younger me approached these works. I wasn't born before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were published, but I was very much alive and reading when The Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales arrived. However, my belief, I remember at the time, was that these books had been around simply forever. And I still find the concept of having read them within a year or two of their release difficult to grasp. The history of Middle-earth is a further extension, including essays, old drafts, even sketch maps Tolkien made on exam paper of his ideas, comprising 12 volumes, but also extending by a further 5 volumes, although not officially categorised as such. I still smile at encountering a map of Beleriand within their pages, with the words "Do not write" in the margin printed on it. These books are of interest to those wanting to dive into Tolkien's writing process, the evolution of his ideas, and how the more well-known works came to be. However, since we're talking about the potential for using Middle-earth as a game setting, they do contain nuggets that can be incorporated into the core canon to add even more flesh to the bones. Before we leave the literature behind for the world of games, I would like to throw Robert Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth onto the pile of essential references. This started life in 1971 as the Guide to Middle-earth, but grew into the Complete Guide in 1978, as it added references to the Silmarillion. The guide is still in print, with later editions having revised references to specific editions of Tolkien's works and adding illustrations by Ted Nasmith. However, the encyclopedic entries it contains have changed very little. Anyway, on to games. The first I came across the idea of using Lord of the Rings as some form of resource for games, outside, of course, the names hobbits, ents, orcs and balrogs appearing in the classic Dungeons & Dragons rules, and Tolkien's works being included in the recommended reading lists for basic and advanced D&D, was an article by Stephen Bland in White Dwarf issue 32, August 1982, that described the Rings of Power, the Nazgul and the Fell Beasts in D&D terms. There was an earlier board war game, The Battle of Five Armies, published by TSR in 1975, but I never have come across a physical copy of that game and knew of it only through magazine reviews, a handful of years after the fact. The White Dwarf article sent me back to my own campaign world's drawing board somewhat. It wasn't specifically the content of the article, but the link that could be made to using Tolkien as inspiration. Up to that point, my inspiration was mainly Celtic, Anglo-Saxon and Arthurian, ironically similar influences to those of Tolkien, but directly connecting fantasy literature to gaming wasn't something my young mind had considered. Anyway, I digress. A couple of years later, Middle-earth role-playing, or MERP, was introduced to the UK via a licensed edition published by Games Workshop. The parent edition, published by Iron Crown Enterprises, had been released in 1984, with the Games Workshop release coming a year after. MERP had 2 points of origin. First was Iron Crown luminaries Pete Fenlon, Kurt Fisher and Coleman Charlton's Dungeons & Dragons campaign from the 1970s, set within Middle-earth. Second was the formation of Iron Crown itself, a vehicle for publishing an evolution of their group's house rules in the early 1980s. Collectively known as Rolemaster, these rules sought to add more detail and mechanical crunch than other games on the market, and were presented in a modular toolkit form to allow individual game masters to assemble those options and systems that best produced the game experience their groups were looking for, generally in combination with the core of other systems such as Dungeons & Dragons. When Iron Crown acquired the license to produce Middle-earth game products, it became a labour of love for its designers, particularly Charlton and Fenlon, the latter having become one of the greatest cartographers role-playing has ever seen. Using Rolemaster as a base, Middle-earth role-playing was specifically tailored to the setting, cutting down those aspects of Rolemaster that didn't suit, and modifying other parts to make them suit. Where Shadow World was Rolemaster writ large, Middle-earth had a gentler, more easily accessed rule set, within the rules and the game's supplements, and they evoked Tolkien's work with care and attention to detail. There are truly no other supplements in the history of role-playing like MERP materials, with even the slimmest volumes packed to the rafters with information aplenty for hungry game masters to consume. Iron Crown introduced an even further cut-down game in the form of the Lord of the Rings adventure game in 1991. It's a fun game, but I am hesitant to call it a lead-in to MERP. But as a simple game connected to the Middle-earth lore, it does work well enough as an introduction to role-playing in general. Unfortunately, things were not on Iron Crown's side as the millennium approached. I scratched the surface of this period in my video regarding the Rolemaster standard system, but it was a black day in the annals of role-playing. It's a well-established fact that movies these days make a lot of money from merchandising and licensing, and I find it no coincidence that Iron Crown's Middle-earth license, negotiated as it was in the early 1980s, may not have been as lucrative as would be expected from a big-budget movie franchise. With Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies in development from as early as 1995, I expect that Iron Crown's license was seen as somewhat anomalous. I won't speculate further, other than to say that the license would be automatically surrendered if Iron Crown went into bankruptcy, and they did just that in 2000, with the first of the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy arriving in 2001. After the Fellowship of the Ring came to cinema screens, a skirmish war game arrived from Games Workshop in 2001 with a new role-playing game, the Lord of the Rings role-playing game, published by Decipher in 2002. Coincidence? Perhaps. Decipher's game was structured around the Coda system, originally put together for their Star Trek role-playing game. Voted Best Role-Playing Game of 2002 at Origins, it was nonetheless relatively short-lived, especially considering MERP's 15 years. A handful of releases covered Tolkien's books and the movies. Unlike MERP, but like the movies and Games Workshop's Skirmish game license, the game was limited to material from The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the latter's appendices. And so, while it does describe gaming within any portion of Arda's historical background, there are pieces missing, largely those expanded from the appendices within the Silmarillion. Ultimately, various financial woes suffered by Decipher into the mid-2000s caused them not to renew their Lord of the Rings licence, and so support for role-playing within Middle-earth went on hiatus. Enter Cubicle 7. Who released a new game based on Tolkien's works in 2011, The One Ring. This game focused on the Wilderlands around Mirkwood, with some supplements expanding things out to Eredor, Arnor, Angmar, Erebor and Rohan. It's pretty firmly rooted in the period of The Lord of the Rings, that is, towards the end of the Third Age. In general, the game is okay. It splits play into active adventure and inter-adventure periods, what other games might note as downtime, here called the Fellowship phase. What kills the game for me, though, is that it places special focus on my least favourite part of Tolkien's works, and the perennial meme of the movies, which is travel. Now, all of that walking the characters do in Middle-earth stories is represented by game mechanics. Well, to be fair, though, it's not a bad game, it's just very thin on the ground. An OGL D20 version of The One Ring, named Adventures in Middle-earth, coming complete with Player's Handbook and Referee Guide volumes, was released in 2016. Personally, these books looked impressive, but were entirely underwhelming in content. Cubicle 7's own battles with its Middle-earth licence caused it to abandon it in 2019, prior to the release of a second edition of The One Ring. The role-playing licence was subsequently picked up by Free League, who have since published The One Ring's second edition and are also publishing a D&D 5e Middle-earth supplement, named The Lord of the Rings Role-Playing. Unfortunately, with the licensing of Tolkien's properties as complex as one might imagine for such an enduringly popular franchise, it looks like something of the scope of Middle-earth role-playing in its extensive delve into lore and labour of love feel to its works may not be possible again. In the 23 years since MERP's end, its successors as the role-playing torch carriers for Tolkien's works have been pretty, have had genuinely high production standards, and have introduced some innovative concepts to the role-playing world. None, however, have come close to Iron Crown's sheer volume of quality writing and, especially, cartography. I have heard in some circles Middle-earth being cited as a low magic fantasy world. I personally disavow that. For me, low magic settings are things like Fitzlieber's Lankmar, Howard's Conan, Asprin's Thieves' World, and similar, where magic, when it does appear, is special, awe-inspiring, and often to be feared. Within Middle-earth, magic is everywhere, is part of the fabric of the place. We're not quite at the level of animated inkwells, but we are in a world where it sometimes seems that everyone has an enchanted blade of some sort. Pretty much everything elves touch is magical in some way, and practitioners of magic, small and large, are, while not common, are relatively easy to find. But, say such folks in such circles, Gandalf was a really low-level wizard, and thus they have missed the point of who and what that particular character and his Istari comrades are. So Middle-earth is not low magic, for magic abounds. Perhaps in a more subtle sense than Dungeons & Dragons' fireballs, lightning bolts and meteor swarms, but it's very much present. There are many other ways in which Middle-earth diverges from what could be called the norm of fantasy role-playing as expressed by Dungeons & Dragons. It's not a kitchen sink world. Virtually every race and culture has deep lore, roots of origin that define their place. Where some game worlds wouldn't blink an eye at throwing in a Dragonborn, such a character would not feel right within the Middle-earth setting. Due to Tolkien's own studies and interests that he brought into the development of the lore and the tales, it has a very Northern European feel to it. Those who have an upbringing associated with England or Germany or Scandinavia seem to have more affinity with its themes. If most of your fantasy experience has come from the very broad net of influences feeding into Dungeons & Dragons, Middle-earth may feel restrictive, and may then lead to the temptation to make it more like D&D, and thus the finely tuned flavour of the setting becomes lost in a mash of over-seasoning. The history lore of the world is deep indeed, but is also sparse enough in several areas to make room for a gaming group's own adventuring tales, without necessarily upsetting the lore. MERP positioned itself, by default, within the Third Age, clear of the Lord of the Rings epic itself, in a gap where a handful of timeline markers exist. Similar gaps can be found throughout the First, Second and Third Ages. The Fourth Age is virtually unwritten, and provides very fertile ground for players and referees to build something unique. Just in case anyone is a Lord of the Rings neonate here, I'm just going to put a sidetrack regarding the ages. In summary, the First Age runs from the creation of the world to the massive series of wars against Morgoth, Sauron's boss at the time, and the resultant collapse of the western portion of Middle-earth, Beleriand, into the sea. This age is around 50,000 years long. The Second Age is largely about elves and men and Sauron, and ends with the destruction of Numenor, Middle-earth's Atlantis, with the world changing form from flat to round. The Second Age is around 3,500 years long. The Third Age ends with the events of the Lord of the Rings and the destruction of Sauron, and is around 3,000 years long. The Fourth Age begins with Aragorn's reign. Because Middle-earth is a work of alternate history, at some distant point after the First Age, the world forms into the familiar shapes that we know today. So as you can see from that sidetrack, there are thousands of years in the canon timeline to play with when it comes to setting adventures in Middle-earth. It all depends on what sort of game you wish to have. Gigantic battles with hosts of elves, dragons, orcs, werewolves and others? Well, the First Age could be your thing. Insidious plots and the tragedy of decline, perhaps the Second Age suits. For something more human-centric, the Third or Fourth Ages could be your playground. One last interesting point of observation for me is on the subject of points of light. This style of play defines a set of safe-ish havens, the points of light, within a field of adventure, possibility and danger. This fits Middle-earth to a T, especially within the Third Age, and it's probably one of the primary reasons Iron Crown chose it for MERP. Here you'll have a handful of such havens, who you are being a determining factor into how safe those havens might be, including places such as the Shire, Rivendell, Minas Tirith, Esgaroth, Edoras and so on. and the swathes of less safe land where orcs and other evils lurk as the shadow slowly seeps back into Mordor. If you can get past the fact that Middle-earth does not represent kitchen sink fantasy, exploring it as a player or a referee is a very rewarding experience. I know I'm going to sound precious here, to quote Gollum about his own treasure, but Middle-earth is a gem that, if you are going to use it as a setting for your games, needs effort put in to understand and play with the lore, rather than trample all over it because tiefling, half-dragon, great old one patronised warlocks are your thing. I think if you have ever read The Silmarillion, you are already partway there. If your only experience of Middle-earth boils down to enjoying Peter Jackson's movies, sure, you'll enjoy the setting, but you'll only be scratching the surface. Remember, Jackson had to play shortcuts in the movie scripts to bring the tale to the screen, despite even the extended length of each entry. I suppose there is nothing particularly wrong with that approach, but for me, you may as well play in the Forgotten Realms or Kryn or another fantasy setting that, while maybe having extensive lore of its own, certainly doesn't possess the roots and breadth that warrant, say, a degree in Greenwood or Hickman studies. I know I'm sounding preachy, and perhaps I am holding Tolkien's works up in too much of a biblical context, but it is genuinely how I feel. If you are going to play in Middle-earth, do justice to the setting. And that is where we come to the various RPGs that have been published for it. I know I have been hammering this point a fair bit throughout the course of this video, but Iron Crown's MERP really is the only RPG that has done justice to Middle-earth. The others may be good in their own way, for one reason or another, but their depiction of Middle-earth itself does not come close to Iron Crown's. Whichever rules you use or you decide to run for a game in this venerable world, I would urge you to track down Iron Crown's supplement. They are, in the main, mostly system agnostic. So if you're looking for high fantasy with a deep and structured lore, with more studies out there to draw from than pretty much any other world, then absolutely Middle-earth is for you. Just please, please treat it kindly.